Hi, I'm Megan Lee. I have done a Bachelor of Psychological Science and I've currently just completed my PhD in the field of nutritional psychiatry. My topic was whole of food diet approaches to mental health, in particular dietary patterns and depression. So something that people in education need to consider when they're doing quantitative research for their PhD is that because in education there isn't a lot of, in your bachelor's degree, there isn't a lot of units on statistical analysis. It's a little bit different to what happens in psychology. In psychology we do 5 different units in stats. So when we come into our PhDs, we're a little bit more prepared for a quantitative type of analysis, but not so prepared for qualitative, so it seemed. In my PhD I did a mixed methods approach, which means using a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative data analysis and mixing them together to form a larger picture. Now, one of the things that we find with students in education is that they get really excited about doing their project, their quantitative project, and they devise an idea of what their data collection should look like. They go out into the field, they collect their data, and then they come back ready to analyze the data. But what we find is that if there is not a specific data analysis plan put in place before you do your data analysis and data collection, then a data analysis could be impossible. So the first step that any education PhD student really needs to take is, before we go out and collect our data, we really need to have a sort of an introduction written. We need to have our research questions very, very specifically operationalized, which means making sure that we know exactly how we are going to measure each variable. And we need to write a methods section, including how many participants you think you will need, what sort of materials you will use, what sort of scales you are going to ask in a survey, what the procedure is going to look like when you do collect your data. And then finally, the most important part of a methods section is that data analysis strategy. How will you make sure that you are collecting and analysing the correct things for the variables that you are interested in researching? So when we say operationalize a question, your research question, what that really means is making sure that each part of your question is measurable. We use variables when we talk about quantitative analysis, and all a variable is what you are interested in researching. So my research question for my PhD was what is the association between dietary patterns and depression? So my variables were healthy diet, which is a diet rich in fresh fruit, nuts, seeds, vegetables, whole grains, and water, and unhealthy diet, which is rich in ultra-processed, refined, and sugary foods. So they are my 2 independent variables. Now what that means is that they're the 2 variables that I will manipulate, or I will be asking questions about, to see what the outcome is in depression. Now that makes depression the dependent variable, or the outcome variable. It's the variable that we want to see what the impact of the manipulation of the survey questions is. So to measure depression and operationalize depression as a variable, we would use something like a depression scale that has already been validated by another researcher in the field. And it's been very well used across the span of time, and we know, because of the validation tools that have happened with that it is definitely measuring depressive symptoms. Now when we measure diet, healthy versus unhealthy diet, I used what's called a dietary screening tool. Again, that is a pre-validated scale that has been used many times by many researchers and has had what's called a factor analysis done on the questions so that they are definitely measuring healthy and unhealthy diet. what happens is if you decide to go and do your study with a survey that you construct, you need to do a factor analysis on that, on a pilot study of about 20 or so people, before you can go and do your full data collection. To find pre-validated scales, you just need to basically Google your variable name and scale behind that. You will also find these scales in the literature in your introduction. So all of the studies that you have looked at that build the introduction and build your rationale for the study will have used these pre-validated scales for your independent and your dependent variables. So when I did my PhD, I had over 2,000 studies on diet and mental health, and I just picked the ones that looked at healthy and unhealthy diet and depressive symptoms and found what other researchers had used, so that when I go to write my discussion, I can compare directly what I found with other studies have used exactly the same scale. When it comes to scales, pre-validated scales, most of them are free to use. Most of them do not have a copyright. There is no such thing as plagiarism. However, there are some that have copyrights and cost money. So you will need to just check out the scale. If you Google the scale's name and reliability and validity, that will be the paper that shows you, the very first paper on that scale, showing you whether or not it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring and whether or not it does have a copyright or costs money to use. If you can't find a pre-validated scale, you may need to look at constructing your own survey. Now, this does happen quite a lot in education PhD studies, because what we are studying in a PhD is usually novel and has never been done before. That's the whole point of a PhD. So on a lot of occasions, I have seen students who need to construct their own survey. Now, what happens there is that we need to ensure that every question in our survey is measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. And then at the end, when we collect our data, the data is actually reflective of the variable or the measurement that we want to measure. So, one of the things that needs to happen when you do your own survey is that you need to pilot that survey with about 20 to 30 participants. They don't have to be part of the population of interest, they just have to be anybody. And then you have to run what's called a factor analysis. And a factor analysis just tells you whether or not the questions that you have constructed actually measure the variables that you are asking to measure. Now, factor analysis is a complex statistical analyses. So my suggestion would be to find someone like a statistician who can help you in doing a factor analysis. But be very careful not to get to the end of your PhD and have collected all your data on a survey that has not had a factor analysis run across it to ensure that it is measuring the correct things. So it's very important when you are doing a PhD to ensure that you have a data analysis plan. A data analysis plan will make sure before you collect your data that you are going to be able to analyze it statistically. I have seen a lot in the past students who go out, get really excited about their project, collect their data, come back, hand a statistician the data to be analysed, and realize that the data, it's impossible to analyse statistically. So I would highly suggest working together at the conceptualization stage of your project when you are thinking about how you're going to collect data, to work together with a statistician. Usually someone in health is really good for that, but you work together with a statistician to make sure that your data analysis strategy is nice and tight before you collect your data. So one of the things that I wish that I had known when I started my PhD was to keep things simple. I decided to do a review of reviews, so an umbrella review of all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have ever been conducted on my topic of diet and depression, then I also decided to do a longitudinal data analysis across 25 years of Australian women in Australia on dietary patterns and depression. And I also decided I wanted to talk to the people about their experiences with food and mood. So this project, although I didn't realize it at the start, was a lot bigger than I expected it to be. And doing a longitudinal data analysis was a very, very complex data analysis strategy. And I had to go and spend a good amount of money and a good amount of time teaching myself the basics of longitudinal data analysis, which was very, very hard. So I would recommend to anyone who's starting a PhD in education to really think about keeping things simple. I hope that this information has been helpful for anyone starting a PhD in education. If you would like some further information on quantitative data analysis, or you would like me to help you with your data analysis strategy at the method stage, feel free to contact the HDR Society. My details are also on my website, meganlovingmeagain.com.